We have before us the opportunity to forge for ourselves and for future generations a new world order.
This is Multipolarity, charting the rise of the new multipolar world order. No European who saw it would have avoided a pang of dread when a meme appeared online this week in the wake of the DeepSeek AI phenomenon. The meme pictured three dragons, one ferocious, and on its chest the logos of OpenAI, MetaAI, Gemini AI, and the US flag. A second, just as ferocious, featured the Chinese flag and the logo of DeepSeek. The third, looking like the kid in primary school who eats the crayons, featured the EU logo and the grafted-on plastic water bottle lid that has become totemic of the EU's failure to do anything but regulate itself out of existence. The message was clear. Europe is increasingly at a crossroads between the coming Eastern powers and the declining Western powers. And if it isn't at the table, it's going to be on the menu. So, the question we'll ask this week is, which way, European man? And to discuss it, we have Glen, a professor at the University of Southeastern Norway and associate editor at Russia in Global Affairs. Professor Diesen's research focuses on geoeconomics, conservatism, Russian foreign policy, and Greater Eurasia. He's the author of many books, including Europe as the Western Peninsula of Greater Eurasia, Geoeconomic Regions in a Multipolar World, The Great Power Politics in the Fourth Industrial Revolution, The Geoeconomics of Technological Sovereignty, and finally, last year, the Ukraine War and the Eurasian World Order. He also finds time to write a very popular Substack and is a regular guest on a range of podcasts, including the extremely popular Duran. We're very glad to have him here on Multipolarity today to talk about Europe, Trumpism, the end of the Ukraine war, and beyond. So, Professor Diesen, welcome.
Thank you. It's a great topic for me, multipolarity. It's very closely aligned with my own interests.
Let's start with multipolarity. I think it's interesting to go from the general to the particular here. I mean, the amount of global change since the beginning of the Ukraine war in February 2022 has been completely profound. Obviously, it goes far beyond war. I think many people who've read history books and have read about how much wars change global affairs are sometimes surprised and don't fully understand how those things pan out. I think we've all had the privilege, although it's a slightly nasty privilege, of experiencing that for ourselves. So I'd really like to ask you to begin with what your general picture over the past 2.5 years, or however long it's been since the start of the war, what do you make of the global changes? How do you kind of conceptualize them in your own mind?
Well, if we would take a step back, I think the best way to understand it is this is a competition or a struggle for a wider world order, or the key questions about how do we preserve security? What does security mean? For the United States, it's been very specific. It pursues a hegemonic peace, that is one center of power, which is required for peace. And indeed, when the United States refers to threat to itself, it often refers to a threat to US primacy, because the security of not just the United States, but indeed the world is seen to rely on US hegemony. Now, it's even a liberal hegemony, you can say, because they assume if there's only one center of power, that will mitigate security competition, simply because there is no competition. If the dominant is a liberal democracy, it will be able to promote benign values in order to transcend some of the nastiness of the power competition. So I think that this is what the Americans are pursuing. The problem with this is if you have a system which depends on hegemony for peace, it means the world can only use US dollar. If the US dollar is threatened, this is a threat to international security. They have to preserve the US banks as dominant. US technologies have to be dominant. This is why they also have to cut down the Chinese in size. US must dominate the seas, which creates, again, conflicts as well with other powers. The US must also have the dominant military. It must be able to not just defeat one great power, but ideally 2, 3 at the same time. Also, the US has to set the rules, which is the US rules-based international order. not international law, which is based on mutual constraint, but rules-based international order, one of sovereign inequality, where the US will have its sovereignty, but others will have to accept limited sovereignty. This is essentially the hegemonic system. And in this system, you can't really manage the security competition. And it's all premised on the idea that the US hegemony is benign. And in contrast, I think not just the Russians, Chinese and others, but the vast majority of the world don't want to live in a hegemonic system. Especially as the hegemon declines, it becomes more aggressive because it needs to defend its dominant military economy. So you will then see the hegemon be less and less capable of being benign, and thus more and more incentives for the rest to abandon this hegemonic system. And I think this is where the multipolar system comes in. The Russians refuse to live in a Europe where it will be surrounded by NATO military infrastructure, because again, if you're going to have a hegemonic peace, what do you do with the largest state in Europe, which is Russia? Well, it has to be the only country who's not part of Russia. This is why the Black Sea have to become a NATO lake, the Baltic Sea have to become a NATO lake. We have to kick out the Russians from Crimea, and it has to be undermined. Now, as we all know, in security competition, if we say that if everyone doesn't have security, then no one will. In this instance, we demand that NATO has 100% security, which means the Russians will have 100% insecurity. Overall, it's fueled this hegemonic order, a very unhealthy way of dealing or discussing security, because in the past, when there was a bipolar system, at least we discussed what were the Soviet security concerns. I mean, who here has ever opened a newspaper or listened to the news on the telly in which they discuss Russian or Chinese or Iranian security interests? We don't. It's only the benign hegemon and aggressive authoritarian states who threaten the hegemon. World peace depends upon. So I think this is what we're fighting about in Ukraine. This is why both sides are willing to risk even nuclear war. This is why they're going so hard against the Chinese. And I think this whole hegemonic system is unraveling. And this is causing a lot of tensions. That was a very long answer, by the way.
No, it was a very good answer, though. And it leads me in very nicely to a question I have for you. I read quite recently a Substack essay that you wrote about the ideas of Mackinder and later Spikeman's expansion of those ideas, and the effect that they have had on US strategic thought and US geostrategic policymaking. I was wondering the extent to which you think those ideas have caused some of the current issues in the world, and the extent to which they have caused the conflict on Europe's eastern approaches. Because it would seem to me that the strategic imperatives of island maritime nations, such as the United Kingdom and now the US, is in direct opposition to the post-Cold War hope, theory, dream, specifically championed by former Soviet President Mikhail Gorbachev, but later by others as well, like Jeffrey Sachs, of a Europe free from Lisbon to Vladivostok. That whole concept, free from Lisbon to Vladivostok, seems to be in direct opposition to those strategic elements first explained by Mackinder and later expanded upon and detailed by Spikeman. I wonder if you can explain what Mackinder and Spikeman's ideas were about the heartland, the rimland, then explain how they have injected themselves into Washington's strategic thought, and perhaps give an impression of whether you think that they have caused some of the problems that Europe's eastern approaches are facing at the moment.
I would just disagree with one little thing, because you mix these two concepts, which is Gorbachev's common European home and Europe whole and free. It was Gorbachev who proposed this common European home. Now, you can visualize it as one European house, and within this house there would be able to house different rooms. So for him, it was ideological distinctiveness. Countries should be able to have their own ideology and systems, but live in a common Europe, which didn't solve its differences through bloc politics. But the Americans actually countered this. They countered it with Europe whole and free. And this has become a NATO slogan since. Now, it sounds almost the same, but this was, if you want to imagine it like one big house with no rooms, just one big room. Everyone has to then follow the liberal democratic values of the United States. And given that the US sees itself as the champion of these norms, it would also then lead this grouping. And there wouldn't be sovereign equality. Instead, it would be sovereign inequality. That is, the US would be able to lead the rest of the world. It can interfere in your domestic affairs to promote democracy, humanitarian intervention, well, whatever it would be. But it's a system then of sovereign inequality. So these concepts are very different. And this is also why the latter ended up prevailing, which is why Gorbachev's common European home never actually played out. But putting that aside, the main idea of Mackinder was simply that you have maritime powers has a tendency to dominate, because in the ancient Silk Road, you would have nomads controlling the Eurasian heartland. By definition, there wasn't a concentration of power. It was very decentralized. Then from the beginning of the 16th century, after the Mongol Empire had collapsed, this is when the Europeans begin to connect the whole world by sea. And again, it takes more of a hegemonic approach, because if you're a maritime power, it's very difficult to diversify. Let's say when I diversify away from the Suez Canal or the Malacca Strait. If you control the seas, you get to dominate Eurasia from the periphery. And this is why the competition between maritime powers, between the British and French, later between the British and the Americans, was always seen as a way to keep safe and also keep the European and Eurasian powers divided. Because the only way a rival can emerge to threaten the dominant maritime power is if a hegemon takes control over Eurasia, or if a group of countries allies against the maritime hegemon. Now, this is something that informed the British policy. It's also something that informed the American very openly. He has stated in strategic documents, and it's been very influential. And this is why you have to keep the Germans and the Russians separated. It's also why Kissinger wanted to split the Russians from the Chinese. But initially it was a concern about Europe, to keep the Europeans divided. But what happened with the invention of the railway in the beginning of the 19th century was you can then begin to build this transcontinental or railways, which goes from Europe to Asia. And this essentially threatened to overturn the strategic advantage of the maritime power. Now, as Mackinder was very concerned, and not just that the Russians were developing this is why Russia is always the main adversary of the British and the Americans, because they pushed these railroads from the mid-19th century down towards India, which was part of the British Empire. And then at the end of the 19th century, the Russians developed also this Trans-Siberian Railroad. So this was seen to be a way of connecting the Eurasian continent and undermining British dominance. Just as a quick note, it wasn't actually only the Russians who did this. Under Friedrich List, for example, in the 1840s, in the expectation that the Americans would come to dominate the world, he even suggested a land bridge, a Eurasian land bridge from Belgium to Bombay in cooperation with the English to balance the Americans, recognizing that connecting the Eurasian land by land would help to balance American maritime power. So it even preceded the Russian connecting this. It's a very long key part of how the great powers seek to control the world. Now, we could never accept Russia into the new Europe after the Cold War. So we pushed them into Asia, which used to be economically backward and stagnant. But now we pushed, again, Russia into the hands of China, and they formed this greater Eurasian partnership where effectively it's a German-Russian relationship on steroids. So this is going to be the key challenge to American hegemon and dominance. So this is the main driving force which undermines American dominance today. It's the technologies, it's the industries, it's the banks, payment system, currencies, commodity exchanges. It's all the economic levers of power which allows the US to preserve its dominance.
Forgive me if this is a slightly naive question. I'm an economist. I'm from an economics background, so I probably don't know the history of this as well as you do, and maybe Andrew does. But this has always been a question to me. So what you've just said makes complete sense to me if you're looking at the world from the perspective of Britain in the 19th century, the British Empire. Britain, without maritime power and presumably its empire or some version of influence, is a small island that is largely irrelevant on the side of Europe. That is where Britain is currently going after the Ukraine war. America is not Britain. It is a potentially continental power. It is the dominant power in the Americas. They have a doctrine, the Monroe Doctrine, specifically geared toward that. It's a huge landmass, full of natural resources, very bountiful. Why is it that the Americans adopted this mindset? I know the micro history where they took it over from British generals to the intelligence services after the Second World War. The baton was handed to them. But why did they accept it? I mean, in retrospect, it's proved so deleterious to America, I would argue anyway, because it only comes into fruition after the end of the Cold War in 1990, 1991, and ever since then, it's been downhill for America. It hasn't gone well for them to take on this kind of British-style imperialism. What, in your view, led to that? Why did the Americans shun their older tradition of keeping to themselves on that continent, recognizing it gave them enormous power, and wanting to go into the world as if they were a tiny island economy off the coast of Europe?
Well, it's a great question, and I'm thinking now that the hegemony is falling apart, and by having to push down and cut down in size rising powers, they're all collectively balancing the US at the same time. Running an empire is expensive. This is running America into debt, and also legitimacy-wise. If you remember the 1990s, it's long gone. They don't have the same legitimacy to rule the world anymore. Most world countries don't want it. And I think it's not the initial strategy the Americans had. Indeed, maritime powers, both the British and later Americans, had what we refer to as an offshore balancing strategy, which means if you are effectively an island state, which Britain is, and also de facto America, it's effectively an island as well. If you're an island, you don't need a large, expensive standing army during peacetime like the Germans or the Russians. Historically, you just have a powerful navy and you'll be safe. Now, if your goal is simply to, as it's always been for the British and Americans, keep Europe and Eurasia divided, just make sure they're all balancing each other, what is your role in terms of fighting wars? Well, for the offshore balancer, what they want to do is stay out of the main wars, save your strength and resources, and you join the war towards the end, after all the other actors have bled themselves dry. They've weakened each other. The offshore balancer, the maritime power, enters the war late, as the British and Americans tend to do. The main objective for them is to ensure that the outcome is one where there's not a dominant power capable of dominating either Europe or Eurasia. You enter the war late towards the end and impose a political settlement which leaves a balance of power in place. No one can dominate and thus challenge the United States. This is what they've always done. There was one exception, of course, and this is World War II. Europe has been burnt to the ground. The Soviets, despite what Donald Trump believes, was not defeated by the Americans, primarily the Soviets. And they suddenly emerged in Europe as this overwhelming, powerful state. And not only capable possibly of dominating Europe, but indeed dominating the Eurasian space as well. This is why the Americans didn't see it as possible to pull out of Europe after the Second World War. Instead, they set up a security structure in Europe and Asia, following Mackin quite openly. So you have a partnership with Japan on the eastern periphery, Britain on the western periphery, and then, of course, try to make some incursions into the Middle East. Establishing Israel, of course, is a good way to project power. And this was the objective. You know, even Eisenhower made this point that if we still remain in Europe 10, 15 years after the war, then we have failed, because the objective was to rebuild the European forces, restore a balance of power, and allow America to pull back so it can regain its strength, not exhaust itself. The Eurasian land power doesn't want to do any land wars. This is a disaster. This is why Iraq was a disaster, Vietnam was a disaster, and definitely Ukraine is a massive disaster because this is a land war. It's in close proximity to Russia, which means it has all the logistic advantage. And also, because it's so close to Russia, they face an existential threat to their survival, which means they will have more reason to fight till the end, employ all weapons, and they have the benefit of logistics. This is why I think the Americans have done something which is not in the interest of a maritime power. If the Americans would pull away today, a natural balance would restore itself. The Russians don't want to be too dependent on China. They would also trade a bit more with India, with the Europeans. A natural, not military balance, but ensure that they wouldn't be excessively dependent once the maritime power established itself too fiercely on the continent, it spends all its resources to hold that bridgehead, and meanwhile other great powers, be it Russia, India, China, they all find suddenly common cause in reducing the power of that aspiring hegemon. The Americans first got sucked into Europe, and they couldn't leave. After the Cold War, the temptation of hegemony was too great, and they went for it, and now they've gone bust.
After the Cold War ended, and the US, I think it's reasonable to say, actually got caught up, or certainly some sections of the US policy elites got caught up in quite a lot of hubris. And they set up ideas like the Project for the New American Century. Barry Posner, who I believe is at MIT, wrote a paper really cautioning against this, and especially insofar as it pertains to the forthcoming war against Iraq, arguing that the basis of US hegemony after the end of the Cold War was that the removal of the Soviet Union as a rival had given the US control over the global commons, whether they be actual things that we get out of the ground or shipping lanes or key land routes or whatever. The US had gained of the global commons, and he argued that Bush and Cheney and neoconservatives wanted to go farther and inject themselves into the disputed zone of those commons. He argued that by doing that, they would give rise to exactly what they were seeking to avoid, and that was powers that could eventually rival the US. He argued that some powers would inevitably chafe against this kind of hyperactivity of the US, and eventually one or two that were powerful enough to stand up to the US would eventually try to do so. And we see that now most visibly with Russia, I suppose, but also with China and several other states. And it seems that US efforts to extend have pushed its two main rivals together, as you alluded to when you answered the first question. And I wonder if that's not only, even if US hegemonic efforts end, it will still be a tremendously powerful nation. Whether this means the end of US hegemony, and more importantly, where does that leave Europe? Where does that leave the US, as Brzezinski said, its bridge onto the Eurasian landmass was Western Europe. Where does it leave Western Europe, in your view, Professor Diesen?
Well, in a very poor position. Let me just say that I think you were very spot on in terms of some of the ideas that popped up in the early 90s. Again, I think it's a bit of an unholy alliance. You had some of these neoconservatives who dreamt about the US hegemony, and then you had liberals who wanted to create a better world, which is possible if the good US would dominate. So again, around the liberal hegemony, a consensus emerged that the US has to dominate the world for the good of the world. And of course,
I'm sorry to interrupt you, Professor Diesen, but I would just add to that there was even British left-wingers who had in the 1960s or in the late 60s been kind of, Paris 68 Paris revolutionary sorts. And even those neo-Trotskyists kind of converted to this idea of US hegemony because they thought a US military power, far from being this evil they had envisaged it when protesting against Lyndon Baines Johnson in the Vietnam War, it was actually a vehicle through which they could kind of project their own interests and ideas about the universal liberation of man. I think Christopher Hitchens is a prime example of that sort of conversion to this hubristic vision.
They wanted a Pax Americana, some peaceful utopia without the power politics and elevation of good values. Irrespective of the benign intentions, it had the predictable consequences. And you mentioned, Wolfowitz. This is the Wolfowitz doctrine. Less than 2 months after the collapse of the Soviet Union, this strategic document was leaked, was published by New York Times and everyone, in which... again, became known as the Wolfowitz Doctrine, how to preserve and cement U.S. hegemony globally. And this actually suggested it has to make sure no rivals can emerge, even allies, be it Germany, Japan, they should also not become too powerful, and you have to make sure that they remain dependent on the United States. Also, adversaries have to be kept in check. Wolfowitz also then called for cleaning house, which meant all the former Soviet friends and allies had to be knocked out. So Iraq, of course, was the first one in the early 90s. And as he pointed out, we might only have a few years before a new rival comes up. So we have to knock out anyone who doesn't effectively follow the US hegemony. And so this was quite, important development. But it's also, again, many people recognized why this would be a disaster, especially for relations with Russia. Keep in mind that in the 90s, the main objective of Russia was to have as good relationships with the West as possible and to integrate into something they call Greater Europe, which is something like Gorbachev's common European home. They wanted to go so fast to Europe that they began to neglect historical relationships in the East, like China and Central Asia, because they were seen as luggage which would hold them back as they were rushing to the West. The West announced we decided not to follow the documents we signed, like the Charter of Paris for a New Europe and make the OSCE the leading security institution. Instead, we create a Europe without you through NATO expansion. This is why so many political leaders in America realized that this would be a disaster. And look where we are now. From Russia's main foreign policy was to get as close to the West as possible. And now its main objective is simply to direct all its economic instruments to the East, and its weapons should point to the West to deter. Furthermore, not only did this common European home go down the toilet in 2014, this was a pivotal year, because this is when they realized with the coup in Ukraine, which the West backed, that this was the death of Greater Europe. So everything Gorbachev dreamt about was finished. The West would focus on trying to expel Russia from Crimea, and they would pursue hegemony instead of peace with Russia. But this wasn't everything. Indeed, since Peter the Great won the Greater Northern War in 1721, the Russians have a Western-centric foreign policy. This 300-year period in Russian history is over, because at the same time as we kill essentially Russia's Greater European dream, is the same time that China rises in the East. And suddenly they don't have to look to Europe for modernization and economic development, which Russia has done since Peter the Great. Instead, they begin now to look towards the East. And again, it's more welcoming, it's more dynamic, it's more competitive economically. Russia has less historical baggage, so Russia's more welcomed in that region. And so Russia has, for the past 10 years now, began to diversify and decouple. And that takes me to my point, which was Europe. Where does Europe stand here? Well, I guess in very brief terms, the Americans, they realized that the main rival now would be China. So they want to get out of Europe and reduce their presence in the Middle East and take the resources and priorities to go to Asia. Meanwhile, they will demand more from the Europeans. They want economic loyalties, political loyalties, but they will have less to offer. So Europe now looks very vulnerable. And even as they take a lot of abuse from the Americans, they're still very afraid that even the Ukraine war will end and America will leave Europe. I don't think they would mind to have a frozen conflict and a long Cold War, something that forces the Americans to stay. And meanwhile, as Europe becomes too dependent on America, this is the whole point. If you have a hegemonic system, your adversaries can be weakened, but your allies become very dependent. And this is what Americans can do now. They can convert their security dependence of the Europeans into economic and political loyalty. Now suddenly the Europeans see America destroy its critical energy infrastructure. Nothing is said. Trump can threaten to take away Greenland from the Danes. There can't be any proper response or reaction. Instead, they're trying to just hush it up a bit and not make any big deals. So I think the Europeans are very exposed. They're being forced to cut themselves off Russia, China, and anyone America tells them they have to reduce dependence on. So you're going to have a Europe which is less prosperous. It will be excessively dependent on the United States. And this is a massive descent. The era when Europe was a subject in international affairs is over. It's becoming an object. It's a piece that's moved around. We still like to think that we're allies standing shoulder by shoulder with the Americans, but we are a vassal. We're the piece now that's being moved around. So I don't see much good future for Europe anymore. unless they wisen up, of course.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if you have any sense of how it got this bad. It kind of surprises me in a lot of ways. Europe, I think they're kind of addicted to the security umbrella. But the security umbrella since 1991 assumes that the Russian Federation is going to invade France or something. And that is ridiculous. Would the Soviets have ever invaded Western Europe? I actually don't think so. But you could make a case that they would have, because they had a communist ideology. The idea that the Russian Federation would invade Western Europe is stupid, and I think until 2014 or 2022, it was probably widely seen in Europe as kind of stupid. So the security architecture, people have been saying NATO's redundant since 91. I'm not saying everybody. And then the economic leverage that the Americans have over Europe is actually non-existent, because the Trump administration is quickly going to wake up to the fact that Europe run enormous trade surpluses with the United States and hold a lot of their debt. Europe is the creditor in this relationship. I've never really understood why Europe is unable to understand its position as creditor in the relationship. It's a very strange thing. But I guess what's your sense is why did they allow themselves to go downhill so much? As recent as Angela Merkel, whatever she said since about her intentions in Ukraine, I don't believe them at all. I think she's trying to rewrite history. I don't know why she wants to portray herself in that way in the history books, but that's up to Angela Merkel. Up until then, Europe had an independent-minded foreign policy, the Chiracists in France and so on. What do you attribute the ultra-vassalization of Europe to? Was it the events around Maidan and the Russian taking of Crimea? Was that the beginning?
Yeah, that's a great question. I might not have a good answer for this one, but we've seen a rapid shift in Europe. Keep in mind that in 2003, the Europeans believed the American invasion of Iraq was wrong, and they stood up against America and criticized it. They would never be in the position to do this anymore. I think 2008 was really the critical point. This is when the Bush administration wanted to push for promising future NATO membership to Ukraine. Now, at the time, Angela Merkel, in her words, recognized that the Russians would interpret this as a declaration of war. So this was seen to be catastrophic. If you read the WikiLeaks cable, the French ambassador, German ambassador, everyone said the same thing. This will likely trigger something of a civil war in Ukraine, and probably Russia would intervene because they can never accept NATO rolling into Ukraine. This is so over the top. At the end of the day, they did roll over. It's not like the Americans were all for this either. The American ambassador then to Moscow, who is now the CIA director, William Burns, he even recognized, and he has this famous cable which is on WikiLeaks, and it's called Niet means Niet, where he pointed out that if we would go down this path and try to pull Ukraine into NATO's orbit, that this would create a civil war probably, and then Russia would also intervene militarily, because there's no way they can accept NATO inside Ukraine. So, but again, the Europeans rolled over. They decided to accept promising future NATO membership for Ukraine. So just gradually bring them in instead of offering them the membership action plan. Effectively, just to make them a de facto member, gradual, and playing the long game. And this is when the the Russians were pushing for a common solution. Indeed, if we go back to 2013, the Ukrainians and the Russians came up with a deal to the Europeans. Let's make a trilateral agreement. The Ukrainians don't have to choose between East or West. They can be a bridge instead of a front line. The EU said no. They didn't come for a trilateral agreement. This is the EU, Ukraine, and Russia should have nothing to do about it. They must have known what would happen in such a situation. In 2014 came along, of course, and then they toppled the government in Ukraine, and then they ignored for the next 7 years the Minsk peace agreement, and since then they haven't raised their voice to the United States. They haven't opposed anything. It does feel very suicidal. They keep calling this unprovoked, but everyone must have seen this war coming. You mentioned Barry Pusson, or I'm not sure how to pronounce his name, but he even wrote a very good article back in 1993 where he looked at the possibility of conflicts between Russia and Ukraine. He even looked at the domestic issues, as the country is very divided. He mentioned a Holodomor famine in which you had millions starving to death, mostly Ukrainians, but it was also Russians. And he argued as long as the Ukrainians see this as being a result from the poor policy of a Georgian dictator, Stalin, they will be fine. But if the Ukrainian nationalists begin to move in and call this a Russian genocide of Ukrainians, then you're going to have war, because then the national identity will be focused around Russians being the aggressor, the imperialist power. Then the huge ethnic Russian-speaking group of Ukraine would have to be pushed down to be de-Russified. Meanwhile, Ukraine might invite hostile powers to check the Russians, and then war would happen. So again, this was common sense. You don't want to start such a conflict in Russia, in Ukraine. And look at the EU Parliament now. You had, who was it, von der Leyen, who said that the Holodomor, I think was her at least, that it was a Russian genocide. What's happening now is madness in the EU Parliament. You have people chanting Slava Ukraini, which only a few years ago the German media warned was effectively like the slogans of the Ukrainian fascists during the Second World War. So we just gone from one step to another to do the worst possible things. If we wanted a war, this is exactly what we should have done. I mean, it's hard to see, because I don't think the Europeans want a war, but the Europeans have done everything they could in order to get a war. I can't imagine what else they could have done.
It's almost like they've deliberately encouraged this process of centering of national identity on the opposition to another nation.
The relationship with Russia has always been difficult. How do you create a Europe where the largest power in Europe, in terms of territory, population, it still implements what Europe decides, but it doesn't have a seat at the table? This is very difficult to get in place. And this is why you need asymmetrical interdependence. You need a system where the Russians are very dependent on the EU, while the EU has no dependence on Russia. In such a situation, if they don't have any other partners, then this is essentially, what we're celebrating in the 90s. Russia has nowhere else to go. The worst possible deal we have for the Russians is the only one they have. So they would simply have to accept a Europe where we impose unilateral concessions on them. To do this, Russia has to be very dependent on the West. Meanwhile, the West has to shed all reliance on, for example, Russian energy. This is why they were so desperate to put consumers and transit states in the same block to have a collective bargaining against the Russians. And I think with the recovery of Russia, keep in mind, when we began to expand NATO, everyone realized in America even that this would cause conflict. But it was premised on the idea that Russia's going to remain weak, so it doesn't really matter what they think. And this is the same with the EU. I think if they could have this extreme asymmetrical interdependence, the Russians could be upset all they want, but they still have to accept the dictates from the EU. I think as Russia began to grow stronger, there was more incentive to bring Ukraine into the fold in order to further shift the power away from Russia and to the advantage of the Europeans. So again, asymmetrical interdependence. I think that was the main ticket. Now, of course, Europe is more or less broken and Russia is going to Asia. So everything went as bad as it could almost.
And what do you make of the energy thing? I guess the initial assumption by the Americans that they had a bunch of energy sanctions on a shelf somewhere in the State Department from the 1990s, and they just dusted them off thinking that Russia was the same country as it was in 1995, and the world was the same. I really think something like that happened. I think somebody will have to do archive work to figure that out in 20 years' time or something. But I think that was the assumption. I think they thought if we cut Russians off from supplying European gas, the Russian economy collapses. I think they genuinely believed that. I don't think it was like some propaganda exercise to smuggle in some true intention. And then what seems to have happened from my interaction with Americans, I don't think all of them mean it per se, but I think they've kind of been forced to adopt a talking point of some sort, come to the conclusion on is that it'll just starve Europe. We didn't really like the single currency. It could have been a threat to American dollar dominance. We want Europe to be strong, but not too strong. So if we cut them off from energy, it'll become weak. Just before I ask the question, I would highlight 2 days ago there was a news story saying that the Chinese are making bids for the unused Volkswagen factories in Germany. Any thought that this was going to improve the geostrategic position of the Americans is completely ridiculous. If you crush your allies, you will be weaker. I mean, this is just complete common sense. But what do you make of that pivot where they think one thing's going to happen? They shut off the gas and Russia collapses and Putin is replaced by a Democrat or something. They think that, and then what they end up getting is an absolute destruction of Europe, and then they rationalize it to themselves. Where do they go from here? It seems that their whole strategy is completely broken down.
I think they've been trapped in a narrative, but it was interesting what you said. There's actually a meme on the internet with this, where they have the EU saying, I'm willing to freeze to death for Ukraine, and then the American says, well, I'm also prepared to let you freeze to death for Ukraine. It's very strange the Europeans are prepared to sacrifice themselves, and of course the Americans letting them. But it's important to see that this conflict in Europe now, the Americans aren't only targeting Russia, they're also targeting Europe. I know it's very difficult to make this point without being lynched these days, but the way a hegemon works is you divide the world into adversaries and allies. Again, you divide and rule. What happens when you have a conflict? Then you have some powerful allies to contain your adversary, and you have some allies which become very dependent. Again, if you look through the American media, every time there's some tensions between India and China, look how excited they are that the possibility that now the Indians will have to align themselves with America, or the panic when the Chinese negotiated improved relations between the Saudis, Qatar, United Arab Emirates and Iran. Suddenly there's no one to contain Iran, and the Arabs will be less obedient. And it's the same in Europe. For so many years, the Americans complained. They tried to sanction Nord Stream. Brzezinski made this argument that the biggest threat to European integration is Germany and Russia getting closer together. This has to stop. With the economic and political independence of too much peace, the Europeans began to talk about strategic autonomy, European sovereignty. These were the catchphrases of the EU. Again, this is why a little bit of conflict is healthy. If you want hegemony, you need to have a line system that divides the world. If you don't have conflicts, then the alliances tend to break down. This is, even NATO recognized this to some extent in the 90s. This was the whole argument, out of area or out of business. If there's nothing to do, the alliance will fall apart. Again, this was a good way of imposing some bloc discipline against Europeans who had become less obedient. Not only the destruction of the Nord Stream, but after you have the Americans imposing this Inflation Reduction Act, where they offer subsidies for struggling German industries which want to move to the United States. And you have now Trump telling the Europeans you have to buy more American energy, which is much more expensive than the Russian. The Europeans will just have to fall in line. As long as the security dependence, they will have to do as they're told. But I also agree with what you said. When I was teaching security strategies at university, I always made a point to students. You shouldn't hate your adversaries, because then you end up with this ridiculous analysis and the wrong calculations. And you mentioned the calculations we had. We're going to defeat the Russians on the battlefield, crash their economy, isolate them in the world. This was the end of Russia. But again, it was all based on contempt for Russia. So in the military sphere, they're all backwards. They can't take a single village. They're fighting with shovels, stealing toilets, taking little chips out of washing machines so they can put in their weapon systems. All these silly stories, which only proved how much contempt and hatred there were towards the Russians. We underestimate them. The Russians were winning on the battlefield for the past 2 years, even though this is not recognized with all the disinformation. And also, as you pointed out, the economy. They were supposed to be broken quite quickly. The reason why the Europeans were willing to jump into the deep end on these sanctions, they believed the Russians could be collapsed fairly quickly. And again, as I warned from day one, because I even worked in Moscow on this whole Greater Eurasia initiative as an academic. They were trying to reorganize their whole economy to the east. What I warned, and what has proven to be correct, is that the Russians can diversify away from Europe. Europe cannot diversify away from Russia, which is why the Russian economy is doing well, while the Europeans are struggling. And the last one, of course, was who is allowed to say that the Russian economy is quite strong and resilient. Before the Russians invaded, you weren't allowed to say this. It can be considered to be pro-Russian. So everyone has to abide by the narrative. And same as this idea that the whole world doesn't like the Russians. If America and the West, representing freedom and loved everywhere, would ask the world to put pressure and isolate Russia, everyone would fall in line. The Chinese never trusted the Russians, all of this nonsense. And instead, we see the opposite. India went from having almost no imports of Russian oil. Now Russia's the main supplier. Russia and China closer than ever before. Hardly any countries outside NATO wanted to join these sanctions. We become so stuck in the narratives. This is the main problem. This is why it's so hard to do course correction as well, because nobody wants to discuss how we ended up in this place, because you have to follow the narrative. If you break with the narrative, a social cost will come towards you.
Yeah, I mean, we've become addicted to propaganda. I said quite a bit on the show that we really are in late Soviet Union territory with the propaganda. It's actually scary. It's blinding us to just about everything. It's spread to the Chinese situation. It's just blinding us to the technological developments that are happening in China and distracting us with nonsense. But it's really scary. But I just wanted to underline something there, because I hadn't really thought about it in that way before, but maybe you can just briefly explain it before I think Andrew wants to move on to Asia. You said basically that, if I'm getting this right, if you have a hegemonic mindset, if the collective entity known as the State Department and its adjacent pieces has a collective mindset of hegemony, then you will just automatically think in terms of divide and conquer. No matter the problem, you will just apply that framework. So as you say, it was divide and conquer with Europe and Russia. So it was, okay, cut Europe off from Russia. That's good for us in Europe because it shores them up as kind of a weaker vassal state, and it'll destroy Russia. And then when the outcome proves to be completely different, it doesn't destroy Russia and it starts completely destroying your ally, you just go right back to the divide and conquer strategy and you say, well, that's okay anyway because it divides and conquers in another way. So I think that's a really interesting way of looking at the problem. I hadn't really thought about it that before. I think it's probably accurate, having dealt with some people in America and in Britain more so. Is the logic, and then of course the propaganda, the mass propaganda comes from that, right? Because you just saturate the media sphere to cover up for all the absolutely crazy stuff that's happening. But then, am I right in saying that the logical endpoint of a structure that's set up to do that, which is the US state, at least maybe Trump will clean it out, hopefully, but if not, the logical endpoint is self-destruction, right?
Yeah, and this is imperial overstretch. This is why I always kept making the point that for America, look where it was in the 90s. It had at least a more reasonable likelihood of success in terms of establishing a hegemonic peace. But these days, the BRICS are already bigger than the G7. The unipolarity or this concentration of economic power is already gone. And for the US to run an empire now, it's not working. What did people warn in the 1990s? Well, they said two things. One, if they're going to try to sustain global primacy, they would have to transfer more wealth from the core to the periphery. You know, the infrastructure would begin to be depleted. You would have more economic troubles at home, more economic differences between people, inequalities. This would create social problems. You would have political instability, political polarization. All of this has happened. I haven't checked the debt clock lately, but they're well over $36 trillion in the hole. This is a huge debt. They can't pay this back. The next financial crisis, they already spent all the tools in the toolbox. Inflation and interests are too low. They can't really fix it anymore. Next time it will probably be a dollar crisis. So anyways, they exhausted internally. And meanwhile, as they warned in the 90s, if you try to stay dominant, all these powers which would otherwise balance each other would now come together to balance you. So this is very damaging for the United States. So I don't think the discussion should be whether or not they should preserve hegemony. I think hegemony is coming to an end. I think you can transition peacefully into a multipolar system, or you can have an uncontrolled collapse, because this is not sustainable. So they need a very different approach. This is why my problem is when I say that the United States should probably abandon this security strategy based on hegemony, because this is what causes all of the conflicts. If they would accept to just be one among many great powers, the Russians would love them, the Chinese would love them. All these powers wouldn't collectively balance the US. The US can withdraw a bit, recover some of its economic strength. And for me, this is a pro-American argument. If you can't take a step back from this mentality that they have to dominate, it sounds as if it's an attack on America, like you're anti-American. I very much agree. I think the United States should recognize this is not sustainable and go for something else. Even Brzezinski, because he's quite important, because he's seen as one of the intellectual who laid some of the main academic work for perpetual hegemony in the 1990s. And even him wrote a book in I think 2012 or 16, where he wrote that the power distribution is shifting now. The US will not be able to dominate the world as it did in the 90s for very much longer. And it had two options. It can either facilitate a shift towards a multipolar system, where America would be the first among equals, or it could try to resist this, but then a multipolar system would still come in place in opposition to the United States. So the US should really embrace the idea of multipolarity. Otherwise, they could end up destroying themselves. I think the world wouldn't benefit from this at all.
What should Europe embrace, though? As we've seen, the European leadership seems very tethered to the idea of suborning Europe's strategic interests to those of the US. However, I would argue, and I think you even touched on this earlier on, as the economic cost of suborning Europe's strategic and economic interests to those of the US becomes ever more apparent to European voters, it'll become far harder to maintain that position. We've seen it with the Dutch ultraviolet lithography company being banned from exporting to China. This is one of Europe's premier technology stocks, and it's banned from trading with one of its biggest customers. As you said earlier on, the US will expect economic loyalty from Europe, but as the cost of that economic loyalty increases, and as it becomes ever more apparent that Europe is being dragged into these conflicts of US interest, it'll become more difficult to keep that away from the politics of individual European states. And indeed, we are seeing the rise of populists across Europe at the moment. The question I've got, though, is that those populists have different views. For instance, Giorgia Meloni in Italy and probably the Party for Law and Justice in Poland are very Atlanticist in their outlook. Whereas people like Viktor Orban and Robert Fico in Slovakia are far more interested in European autonomy, and I guess Marine Le Pen would be as well. They're far more interested in Europe really generating its own strategic plans and ideas and following policies of its own interest. So what's your assessment of the chances? You know, on Multipolarity, we always call this battle the battle between the autonomists and the Atlanticists. What would your view be on the chances or the outcome of that battle? And what future do you see for Europe realistically?
The key word you brought up here was interests, and I don't think the Europeans are pursuing their interests. As I said before, they just want to do whatever the Americans want, so the Americans will stay. This is the political leadership. They're, more or less, they lost their minds in terms of not pursuing their national interest anymore. In Germany, people are asking, why are we buying Russian gas from India? It's the same gas. The Russians are still getting paid, but we're paying much more. What is the point of this? Just to keep up appearances, to pretend as if we're taking a firm line? Or it's all, everyone's recognizing this is nonsense. Why aren't we negotiating with the Russians? We know that they're winning. Every day, the casualty rates in Ukraine are exploding, and the cities are falling faster. Any deal tomorrow will be worse than today. So it's not an option between winning or losing. It's between how bad you're going to lose. So why aren't we negotiating? And nothing they're doing is anymore rational. It's all been captured in this narrative. So in a system where the political leadership no longer sufficiently pursues the national interest, in which they subordinate themselves to the United States in this crazy way. Again, look, when the United States, they blew up Nord Stream. The president in Germany gave a medal to Joe Biden. It is beyond belief. Nothing really makes sense anymore. What happens then? If a country stops defending its national interests, it will lose its legitimacy. And this is what you're seeing across Europe. There's a crisis in political legitimacy. Look in Britain. These people aren't very happy with the government. It can't continue much longer, much like the previous ones. Macron continues to have new records in terms of low approval rating. He came in third in the election. He still tries to cling to power. In Germany as well, they had to call elections for next month. government after government can't really continue like this because they're not pursuing their interests. And meanwhile, you see the United States, they can just continue, they can cannibalize the German industries, the European ones, and they're not doing anything. So I think a huge crack will come, and whatever political powers replace them, we never really know what they are. Romania, they did. You look at the candidate who won the election, the presidential election, but he was the wrong candidate who won. He wants to end the Ukraine war, so they just annulled the election results, just cancel democracy. This is truly, troubling developments. Meanwhile, as all of these things are happening, there's some few rational countries left in Europe. Hungary would be one of them, where you have Viktor Orban, who tries to, for example, make peace. He goes to Kiev, he goes to Moscow, and the EU responds by trying to punish him. It's really wild what's happening. So I think we're inviting a lot of political instability in the future from these horrible decisions which are being made today.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I think some people are very excited about political developments in Europe. And I think some of them will be positive, but some of them could be very negative. There's a lot of concern in the Central European region at the moment about what post-war Ukraine rump state actually looks like. Is it violent? It's filled with weapons. Do they create a kind of stab in the back theory that we saw in Germany after the First World War? It would be a pretty credible theory, wouldn't it, to say we were stabbed in the back? There are serious concerns about this. Looking into that sort of a future, we don't really want to think about it too much. But on a more optimistic note, I'd love to get your thoughts on the initial forays of the Trump administration. Obviously, Trump got elected to try and put an end to this war. Personally, I believe he is firmly committed to it. I think J.D. Vance is extremely committed to it. And it does appear that they're doing a real clear out of the national security apparatus there. There's news stories coming out this week. It doesn't look like the 2016 scenario at all. It's not their first rodeo. There's staffers on the bench. I'd love to get your sense of that. Not really on the specifics of the war. I think we're going to find out about what happens about that in the next few weeks. And I don't think speculating on it is productive. But what do you think broadly, from what you've seen from the campaign, from the appointments, from the first 10 days at the time of recording, are you optimistic that America will get itself out of the hole it's dug itself in, and hopefully we can crawl out through that tunnel as well in Europe? Or do you think that the forces are too strong and the sort of inevitable play out of a collapse will actually occur?
It would be too many speculations, but if I can just have one quick point on your last comment about the stab in the back, it's not completely unreasonable, because in 2022, when the Americans and British convinced Zelensky to abandon the peace negotiations and instead go for a long war, the deal more or less was, you'll get all the weapons you need to defeat Russia and we'll make you a second Churchill, essentially. And so there was a promise made there. Even now, the former advisor of Zelensky, Arostovich, he recently made the point that the West didn't let us make a peace in early 2022. They still won't let us make a peace. They still want to use Ukrainians to fight, even though we're being bled dry. So stab in the back, I think to some extent it's a cop-out, but there's something behind it as well. If they feel betrayed and used by the West, it's possibly because they were used by NATO to weaken Russia. They said this quite open many times. Anyways, in terms of what to expect from Trump, well, not expect, he's in power, sorry. I think you're correct. I think a lot of the focus of him will be on fixing a lot of the domestic problems. So one would be draining the deep state, as he said. I wasn't sure if it was going to be, because he didn't do it the last time, but I thought maybe he learned his lessons, and indeed, he's taken some very severe measures, though. So it does look like this is going to be a key focus of his. I just saw in the news today that media from Ukraine as well as Hungary, there's media now complaining. They say, we're independent media, but we lost the overwhelming amount of financing because USAID isn't giving us money anymore, which is an interesting definition of independent media when a foreign power finances you, and obviously that impacts your... But anyways, I think a lot of this system which the United States has built up to manipulate civil society, not just within the US, but also outside. I think especially about NGOs. A lot of this is being drained, firing a lot of stuff which is believed to belong to the permanent bureaucracy. So there's a lot of things happening. So I think he's more worried about the enemies within. But beyond that, I think it's also, when we mentioned the Monroe Doctrine, I think, yes, he recognizes that new powers are emerging, other places like China, which will be able to challenge the US position. He wants to restore, in America's part of the world, their Monroe Doctrine, so their regional hegemon, which is why he wants to take back the Panama Canal, seizing or bringing Canada into the United States, or taking Greenland from the Europeans. I think a lot of his instincts are correct in terms of how we see the conflicts with Russia. His approach has been very dangerous and problematic, but it remains to be seen. I think behind all the bombastic bluster, there's a lot of sense to what he's doing. If you look at how the international distribution of power is shifting, instead of doubling down on the failures of the past, he's taking a different path. I'm not sure if this will be successful, but within the chaos, there seems to be some structure.
I think we should probably wrap up this now. Before we leave, Professor Diesen, is there anything you would like to direct our listeners toward, any of your work? We know you have a Substack, which is excellent. I believe you also published a book last year about the Ukraine conflict and Eurasia. Is there anything you would particularly like to encourage our listeners to look up?
Yeah, the primary place where I publish now is on Substack. I write articles frequently. I also do a YouTube program, but I upload those on Substack as well. So everything can be found on Substack. And I had a book. It was my 11th book. It came out in almost a year ago. It was it's called The Ukraine War and the Eurasian World Order, which is about the Ukraine war and also how the unipolar system is being replaced under this Eurasian framework. So it's you can go buy a copy, or if there's no money, just visit my Substack. So
yeah, I'd like to say that I started reading your Substack at the back end of last year, and it's really worthwhile reading. It's packed with high quality academic work, but in a very accessible, readable way. So I'd encourage everybody to go and read that Substack. And if you have a few shekels, euros, dollars, or pounds, probably pick up the book as well.